Video games have come a long way in the last 50 years, haven't they? It's absolutely insane that we've gone from this to this over the course of only half a century. Gone are the days of using our imagination to perceive two lines and a square ball as a game of tennis, as we've advanced into the age of epic narratives, detailed worlds, and the potential for endless creativity. Now, within the realm of video games, anything is possible, anything can be created, and that's just awesome. Of course, video games haven't always been this advanced or in-depth. Like, in their infancy, they prioritised simple and challenging gameplay over narrative and complexity. But where does this design mentality come from? Well, to get an idea of this, we need to have a look back at where the video game industry really kicked off: the arcade. Arcade games were generally based on the same structure. They were repetitive, mind-numbing, and based on the principle of earning points for the sake of a high score, rather than actual progression. That may sound boring, and by today's standards these games probably don't seem like anything special, but I couldn't disagree more because some of these arcade games are absolutely fucking brilliant. I can't get enough of stuff like Space Invaders, Pac-Man and Galaga. Just pure and simple pieces of bite-sized fun that can last you an eternity if you're good enough at them. Which I am absolutely not. With the massive success of companies like Atari, Namco and Taito, it's only natural that other companies would rear their heads in to try and earn some of those lucrative little arcade crumbs. And of all the companies to do so, without question the most historically and culturally significant would be Nintendo. Nintendo is as essential to video games as butter is to bread. What started out in 1889 as a toy company founded by Fusajiro Yamauchi has become a globally celebrated behemoth of interactive entertainment. They have a list of games that's seemingly endless and an inviting design mentality that aims to produce games for everybody. There's a reason why they're one of the most beloved companies in the world. Now, I'm not going to say Nintendo's perfect, since there's still a fairly healthy dosage of to go around, but the fact still stands. Nintendo is an absolute juggernaut of a company, and I'd be lying if I said I had any major bad will towards them. They're pretty lovable as far as shitty corporate entities go. Nintendo began producing video games in the mid-1970s, but it's a bit disputed as to what their actual first game was. Some say that it was the laser clay shooting system, a light gun based shooter in which players would aim a plastic rifle at moving targets, and a mechanism would determine whether or not you actually shot the target. That's cool and all, but it never actually left Japan, and even then, photo and video footage of the game is incredibly hard to come by. Others, including Nintendo themselves, have cited the horse racing game EVR Race as their first, but it was incredibly complicated and, again, never left Japan. But let's be honest, these previous games were a bit too complicated and inaccessible for a general audience to latch onto, so Nintendo needed a new property. Something that they could use to lure in the masses, to draw the attention away from Pac-Man. A new killer app, if you will. Or a killer ape. Donkey Kong first released in arcades in 1981 and was designed and produced by two of the company's most important and respected figures. The late great Gunpei Yokoi and first-time game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, both of whom would also return for the game's sequels. It received ports to every major home console of the early 80s, and was also released as a launch title for Nintendo's first home console, the Famicom, in 1983. The Famicom was later released in the States as the Nintendo Entertainment System in October 1985, but Nintendo didn't publish this game on the NES until 1986 for some reason. This is the version of the game that I'll be playing, as is the case with all the other games in this video. I will give you a warning though and say that this probably isn't the ideal version of the game to play. Donkey Kong is already an incredibly short game, only lasting 4 levels in total, but the NES port only has 3 of these levels, scrapping out one of the levels entirely, as well as rearranging the remaining ones. While the NES version is perfectly playable, the removed content does kind of make it the weaker version by default, even though it's the most universally recognised and widely played. And bugger me backwards was this game widely played. It should go without saying, but Donkey Kong is easily one of the most important titles in video game history. It was one of the first games to have an actual premise, one of the earliest to convey character emotions through visual assets known as cutscenes, and was one of the earliest games to spawn the platformer genre. You know, when I think about it, this is an odd bugger of a game. It has the design mentality of a platform game with an emphasis on jumping and level completion, but it's still fundamentally a high score based game. You play as this little red-hatted, blue-dung-eyed bloke and climb up ladders, avoid barrels and fire, and jump over pits in order to rescue your girlfriend, known as Lady in this game, from the eponymous ape. The game itself was, well, it was alright. It's simple to pick up and play, I like how these levels are constructed, and I actually think the sound design is really good. I don't know why, but I really like the squeaky noises if your character's running. But sadly, there are a few areas where I think this game is held back a good bit by its age. The controls are stiffer than a hard-on, there's very little variety, you could beat the 3 stages in about 2 minutes, and the game just loops on itself every time you actually manage to win. Also, I never found the hammer weapon to be particularly useful since you can't climb or jump with it, so it just halts your progress. Like here, where the fuck am I supposed to go here? I'm stuck. The game does get gradually harder as it goes on, so at least there's some replay value, but otherwise, I don't think it's aged as well as Pac-Man or Gallagher, I'll put it that way. I do think there's a great game here somewhere, but it's a bit too limited on content and doesn't really demand future visits. But still, this game does have a massive legacy. It was a colossal success. It was the highest grossing arcade game of 1981 and 1982 when it hit the American market. And it inspired a lorry load of merchandise that made it one of the premier titles for the golden age of arcade gaming. In fact, the game's success actually resulted in a lawsuit from Universal Pictures, who claimed that Nintendo were infringing upon their film King Kong, because of both the similar name and the narrative focusing on a gorilla kidnapping a young woman. Now, King Kong was a direct inspiration for Donkey Kong, I think that's fairly obvious, but the court ruled in Nintendo's favour once they argued that Universal had no grounds to sue them since the character was in the public domain. Not only did Nintendo receive a pretty big settlement of $1.8 million in damages, but the event also cemented Nintendo's place in the American market. I mean, think about it. This game was so big that fucking Universal Pictures saw fit to try and get in on some of its success. Donkey Kong wasn't the first Nintendo game, but it might as well have been. And while I don't think it's a great game in terms of its controls or content, I can't really bring myself to hate it just because of the huge impact that it had on the medium as a whole. And I would say not just down to its gameplay. Everybody knows this by now, but probably the biggest mark that this game left on the industry was providing Nintendo with not only a corporate mascot, but the face of video games as a whole. I'm of course talking about Jumpman. Yeah, when this game first came out, this little red-hatted, blue-dung-eyed bloke was called Jumpman, which, I mean, hey, you have to give Nintendo credit. That sure is a descriptive name for him. He jumps, and he's a man. But then Miyamoto said, oh yeah, this character needs an actual fucking name, and gave him the more recognisable name of Mario, after the real estate developer Mario Segali, who was renting a warehouse to Nintendo at the time. But hey, now this character has an actual name, and thus an icon is born. Mario, a name that inspires such images of heroism as saving the princess, the Mushroom Kingdom, and the galaxy. And he spends his second appearance kidnapping a fucking monkey. With any successful game, there must come a sequel. Ms. Pac-Man came out in 1982 to great success, even greater than Donkey Kong when accounting for total gross profit, and I think Nintendo must have felt uncomfortable with any new competitors emerging to overtake their ape king. As such, Donkey Kong Jr. was also released in 1982 in the arcade, with console ports arriving in 1983, including the Famicom, but again, Nintendo didn't release this game on the NES until 1986. Again, I don't understand the delay with the NES port. Maybe Nintendo just thought that America hated monkeys. But if that was the case, then they should have released this game as soon as possible, because this game hates monkeys. Mario is fed up with Donkey Kong's bullshit and locks him in a giant cage. You play as Donkey Kong Jr. as he climbs up ropes, avoids enemies and collects fruit in order to reach the top of the stage and rescue his dad. It's a pretty radical departure from the first game considering the drastic role swap between Mario and DK, as the glamorous gorilla is instead playing the victim role, but it makes Donkey Kong Jr. strangely interesting in a way. I have to say, I think the gameplay here is really solid. There are only 4 levels, granted, but they're all very well designed. They're designed in such a way that every level kind of plays out like a mini puzzle, in that you need to find out the best method of traversal without getting poked by an enemy or falling to your death. And that's cool, it makes Donkey Kong Jr. a bit more engaging than the original game. It's not as easy to pick up and play because of the trickier levels and more complex control scheme, but I still think the gameplay is more rewarding here. I actually really like the controls, since there's a lot more to them than simply jumping over barrels and waiting for stuff to collide with your hammer. DK Jr. can climb up or slide down the rope, but he also has a second frame in which he reaches out to grab either a second rope or a piece of fruit. When he's holding onto two ropes at once, he moves twice as fast upwards but half as fast downwards. And that doesn't sound like a big difference, but with level design that brings you this close to the enemies, it can play a big role in how you approach them. I also love the role this plays in the final level, as you need to get these keys up to the locks, and being able to simply them up like this is really satisfying. Although I do have to wonder, just what the fuck is going on with level 3? Like, what even is this place? Why is it so futuristic and strange, and why is the music so ominous? I know this game isn't held up to the same level of esteem as its predecessor, but quite honestly, I find it to be a better time overall. It's similarly brief, but much more skill-based and interesting. It feels a good bit more polished, and the level design is great. I'm surprised, but I really enjoyed this one. Donkey Kong Jr. was still a success, but nowhere near as much as the original game, which is a real shocker to me. I personally think it offers way more gameplay variety and quality. But still, it didn't do as well, so Nintendo looked at that and thought, well, we have this pretty good game here, but it didn't do as well as we wanted it to, so what was missing from it? Learning. Donkey Kong Jr. Math, that would be Maths, is a Famicom/NES exclusive title released in 1983 in Japan and 1986 in the West. It's worth noting that Shigeru Miyamoto didn't return for this one, and the game was instead held by Toshihiko Nakago, who would later work as lead programmer on major Nintendo projects such as the NES Mario Trilogy and Zelda Duology, as well as serving as a production supervisor for a good deal of Nintendo's 21st century output. Because of course, when I think of this, I also think of this. This game is really fucking stupid. You play as Donkey Kong Jr. as your beloved ape father stands idly at the top of the screen and holds up numbers for you to produce as part of a sum. You do so by collecting numbers and arithmetic symbols. So for example, if he holds up the number 26, then you would need to collect 6 times 4 plus 2 or something along those lines. There doesn't seem to be any limit on how much you can actually collect though, so if you're genuinely mathematically challenged, then you can probably still win just by bullshitting your way through with trial and error. I also love how by pure fucking chance I got the number 77 3 times in a row. You do 5 of these levels, and the game boots you right back out to the title screen. There are 2 other game modes, one of which is exactly the same thing as the first game mode, but you don't have to create the number from absolute scratch. And I will admit that this is marginally more challenging. It's still incredibly easy since there's still no limit on how many numbers you can collect, but it does at least require a wee bit more thought since you're working with larger numbers, and a lot of the time they're negative as well. This third game mode though, I don't know what the fuck I'm supposed to take away from this. You don't have to actually solve anything, you just have to move this key up to the top of this stage and then the sum solves itself. This is pointless. You're not actively involved in the maths yourself, so how are you supposed to learn anything from it? Look, there's no way that a game called Donkey Kong Jr. Math was going to be particularly good, but even for what it is, it's incredibly simplistic and tedious, and I feel like a moron for even having given it this much time of day. If there's anything this game has going for it, it does have a much more wholesome depiction of the DK universe. I mean, there's no kidnapping here, there's no animal cruelty, just a loving father and his son bonding together as they do some simple equations. That's just lovely. I'm happy to see Donkey Kong turning over a new leaf. That is until the third game in the Donkey Kong arcade trilogy, that aptly named Donkey Kong 3. This one was released in arcades in 1983, on the Famicom in 1984, and the NES in 1986 yet again. DK is back to being a prick again, a pretty strange development to make after the last game had such an innocent depiction of him. But you're not in control of Mario this time, no. You instead control this new character, Stanley the Bugman, a fumigator whose greenhouse is under attack from the majestic monkey and an array of giant insects. He is easily one of my top 3 protagonists in the Donkey Kong trilogy, to be fair, but he also represents a drastic change in gameplay for this entry. Stanley is equipped with his trusty bug spray and he needs to shoot DK up the arse with it, as well as eliminating any bugs that come close to either him or his collection of plants at the bottom. It's more akin to a 2D shooter than a platformer, albeit one with mediocre range and awkward controls. Both the A and B buttons shoot, which means that jumping is bound to pressing up on the D-pad, and I'm the kind of person that hates pressing up to jump in anything that isn't a fighting game. It's completely redundant since the A and B button have the exact same function. I can't see any reason not to have A jump and B shoot. It's also a fucking nightmare to dodge incoming enemies since jumping locks you horizontally, meaning that it's impossible to move to the side to get out of an enemy's way. If anything though, the game's biggest issue is that it's basic as all hell. Like, Donkey Kong was a simple game, but at least there was some strategy in how you approach the levels considering they each had substantially different layouts. Here, a lot of the time you can win the first couple of levels just by jumping up twice and then mashing the A and or B button, and the other level doesn't take much more thought either. Yeah, there's only 3 levels in this game as well, and there's nothing interesting to say about any of them whatsoever. The enemies themselves can pose a threat sometimes, but because of their random patterns combined with the control that isn't geared up for dodging them, it often feels luck-based as to whether you succeed or not. I suppose I can at least say that the exploding enemy does make you consider your positioning somewhat. Regardless of this though, I often find that the best strategy is to ignore your surroundings and to try and rush DK. And I hate this design mentality. It doesn't reward player engagement, it instead encourages you to go brain dead. I don't find it to be terrible necessarily, but it's easily the most boring of any of these Donkey Kong arcade games. A lot of the time it simply devolves into button mashing monotony, and considering it adds nothing long term to the series, there's very little reason to go back to this one. Donkey Kong 3 is the only game of the trilogy that could have been considered a commercial failure in the States, but it did okay in Japan. I imagine it probably failed in the States because it was released in the wake of the video game crash of 1983, but that's just pure speculation. But I do still have one major question. We haven't seen Mario for a couple of games now, so where the hell is he? Well, that question was answered with the release of the arcade game Mario Bros. No, not Super Mario Bros, just Mario Bros. This is the first actual Mario game, released in arcades in 1983 and receiving a port to home consoles later that same year, and yet another port to the NES in 1986. Mario continues his war on animal kind as you control him as he goes on a killing spree of innocent turtles and crabs that come out of these green pipes in the sewer. Unlike the series' later entries though, you can't actually jump on them. You instead have to jump under them to knock them off their feet and then give them a good kicking. How barbaric. It's not very good. Basically, the only objective is to defeat all the enemies on screen in order to progress to the next phase, as the game calls them, which is really just a repeat of the same level with different enemies that don't pose any kind of new challenge. This game is pretty hard, but for all the wrong reasons. Like Donkey Kong, the controls are incredibly stiff, but with Mario's increased jump height and need for greater precision, I found it to be more of an issue here. You have zero control over Mario's jump while he's airborne, just like in Donkey Kong 3, which often makes the level a pain in the arse to navigate, even with a design as simple as this. These special stages are a bit of a faff as well, since you can't really waste any of your limited time. You need to collect these coins perfectly without making a single cock up. You can play this game in 2-player, marking the first appearance of Mario's brother Luigi, so that's kind of a fun novelty. At the same time though, I don't see the point in making somebody else suffer, so I'll just quit while I'm ahead and say that this isn't Miyamoto's finest work. It's completely devoid of variety, and the rigid controls make this game a bit rough to go back to. Quite honestly, I don't think anybody would think much of this one if it wasn't for the fact that it is the first Mario game. It's really not that great of a game in general, but there are some other interesting points to make about this game though. Other than Luigi, it introduced the precursor to the Koopa Trooper, known as the Shell Creeper. It introduced POW blocks and coins to the franchise, and to this day I'm pretty sure it is the only game in the franchise that explicitly focuses on Mario's occupation as a plumber. Yeah, for saying that's one of the supposed trademarks of the character, it's odd that no other game has really drawn attention to the fact that Mario is a plumber. It always seems like something that gets brought up as a curiosity rather than set in stone series lore, but it's still kind of cool that Mario's earliest outing is the one that depicts his job the most blatantly. And so, with the next entry, Mario completely changed his fucking career as he decided that plumbing wasn't quite cutting it, instead taking up demolition. Wait, what? This is Wrecking Crew, the last game I'll be talking about for this video, so don't worry, you're in the home stretch. It was helmed predominantly by Satoru Okada and Yoshio Sakamoto, arguably two of the most important figures in Nintendo's history. Both have had heavy involvement with the Kid Icarus and Metroid series, with both of them designing the NES games, and the latter being the director of Super Metroid, Fusion, and Zero Mission. Satoru Okada in particular though, is best known as one of the creators of the original Game Boy, and he even directed two of its best-selling titles, Tetris and Super Mario Land. That alone probably makes him the most lucrative person Nintendo has ever employed, but now I'm just spewing irrelevant bullshit. Wrecking Crew was released in arcades in 1984 and on home consoles, both the Famicom and the NES, in 1985. In fact, this was one of the 17 original launch titles for the NES. It's cool that this arcade port was released relatively early compared to the previous games, but it just raises the question, why the hell was this game released so early on the NES? It's not really a big issue in the grand scheme of things, but I do find it kind of interesting that this game got a home console release before the pre-established cash cows like Mario Bros and Donkey Kong. But that's not what really matters. What does matter is, how does the game hold up? You play as Mario and you're equipped with this giant hammer, and apparently it's heavy as fuck since you can't jump with the thing. Your objective is to smash down these grey walls and ladders in the background while avoiding enemies and fireballs. Sometimes you get these special stages where you have to collect a coin hiding behind a wall before this guy does, but the meat and potatoes of this game is mostly breaking down walls and ladders. And I have to admit that I do find the core gameplay of this title to be decently fun, mostly down to one thing: the level design. Because you can't jump, it makes each level that bit more interesting to traverse and work out, kind of like the more recent game Captain Toad Treasure Tracker for the Wii U and Switch. What order do I destroy walls in? Is it safe to destroy this ladder? It starts out simple, but quickly ramps up in difficulty. Maybe a little bit too much too quickly. I think the difficulty spike is a bit severe and it gets really bullshit towards the end. The game draws all of its difficulty from the enemies and their placement, and you would think that Mario would be able to defend himself from these guys considering he spends the game smashing walls with a hammer, but no, he's strictly limited to using his hammer on the Z axis, meaning that if you get sandwiched in between two enemies, you're beyond fucked. You can lock enemies behind doors and trap them in barrels, but this is dependent on the level you're playing, meaning that you're completely defenceless throughout much of the game. It's incredibly frustrating. But even that doesn't compare to this game's most fucking obnoxious attribute: this prick, Foreman Spike. This knobhead goes around with a hammer of his own, trying to either knock you off a platform or actively prevent you from being able to complete a level by destroying ladders, meaning that you can't access the walls that you need to demolish. I think that the game could have done without him. He adds too much frustration and luck to a game that should be based on skill and strategy. It's also incredibly easy to get yourself stuck in general, but fortunately you can return to the title screen with a press of the select button. A nice quality of life feature. There are 100 levels in this game, an impressive amount for an 8-bit game in 1985, let alone a launch title, and easily the most out of any game in this video. But I don't think this game offers enough variety to warrant that many levels. Fortunately though, you can choose to play any level you want from the title screen. Yeah, just press A or B and you'll cycle through the stages in ascending or descending order respectively. This is an absolutely excellent feature. It's a great way to employ something akin to a save feature without having to inflate production costs. And it also speaks well to the nature of this game, since it's very simple and repetitive. So this means that you don't have to plough through it in one sitting as you do with other NES games. There's even a level editor here and it actually works really well. It gives you as many options as you would want to have, but as you can tell, I'm a very uncreative person. Although not perfect, Wrecking Crew isn't a bad game overall. It offers a hefty amount of content for what it is, the gameplay is built upon a solid foundation, and the music is catchy and arcadey. In fact, this was one of the earliest works of legendary Nintendo composer Hirokazu Tanaka, who helped to co-develop the NES sound chip and would later lend his talents to the aforementioned Metroid, Kid Icarus and Super Mario Land. Pretty cool stuff. Of course it suffers from some NES bullshit such as awkward enemy placement and player unfriendly mechanics, and the glut of levels and trial and error based gameplay means that it will take you some time and concentration to beat this one, but I don't think there's much point. It's not as though you actually get anything for doing so. I'd say the only reason to beat this game in its entirety would be if you were making an overlong YouTube video about 8-bit arcade games, but fortunately there aren't many of you out there that are sad enough to fall under that description. So that is all the Donkey Kong and Mario arcade games, and the question is now, do they hold up? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. While a couple of these games, namely Donkey Kong Jr. and Wrecking Crew, have just enough gameplay depth or longevity to be worth a play nowadays, especially the former, most of them only really work when viewed for what they are, product of their time. Whether it be because of their sloppy controls or their complete lack of anything going on, I think modern audiences would struggle to find much substance in them. I can at least respect titles like Donkey Kong and Mario Bros for their immense impact on the industry and the medium. Donkey Kong 3 and Junior Math, yeah, there's no dancing around it, I just don't respect these games at all. But still, I'd be a complete arsehole to disregard these games entirely. Were it not for these, we would never have gotten the larger Mario or Donkey Kong franchises. And considering that some of my favourite games of all time belong to these series, I can't really complain much. While I wouldn't recommend you play these games for fun nowadays, I still think they're worth looking at if you're interested in the history of the medium. They're available on the Switch Online service if you want to play them, with the exception of Donkey Kong Jr. Math. I know, I'm as heartbroken as you are. But now, we must move on to bigger and better things. I just said that these games weren't notable so much for their own qualities as much as they were for what followed on from them. And I can promise you this much, this isn't the last we'll be seeing of either franchise. In fact, we might be taking a look at Mario sooner than you think. Until next time people, signing out.